Well, it has been a lot of fun for me to make all these videos, and I realize now that this is the last lecture one that I'm going to be giving for you here in our first ever Greek mythology online course for University of Rhode Island. So let me say thank you very much for coming through this journey with me, and I hope it has been a rewarding one. And the last thing that we're going to talk about for today on July 25th is a bit about the transformation of the Roman Republic into the empire. You should keep open the scheduled item on Sakai because there's the second part of that outline that you should scroll down to. I probably will not cover everything that's on that outline here in the video because I'm going to focus mostly on Augustus's time as well as some understanding of how Greek mythology is transformed into Roman mythology so that you understand what the real intent is of the Romans to use mythology. Okay, so the first thing I want to do here is talk a bit about Augustus himself as to exactly who he was. You should realize that with Roman mythology, of course, we have all the various gods. So as a tribute to Jupiter, I present you with our eagle right here. And the eagle here reminds you that Jupiter is in fact the major figure in Ovid's Metamorphoses, who ascribes to Rome the successful evolution from creation into the brand new empire that Ovid celebrates reasonably enthusiastically in the Metamorphoses. All right, so let's talk about Augustus himself. So Augustus's Principate essentially is the culmination of about a century of total civic disorder in the Republic, as we alluded to in previous videos. It's outlined for you in your handout. I can cover a little bit of it here. So as we mentioned before, we had the two tribunes, the Gracchi brothers, who were attempting to rectify the unevenness between plebeians and patricians. Although we've been talking up to this point about strictly plebeians and patricians, actually the picture had become much more complicated than that by the time of the Gracchi brothers' tribunal positions, because you now had patricians up at the top, then you had plebeians who had been successful in business, in commerce, who had made a real living for themselves very successfully, even though they did not have the pedigree of the patrician family connection. So that particular group of plebeians, the wealthier ones, came to be known as equites, or knights, those who were wealthy enough to own and train horses originally, but it then came to mean anybody who was in business for himself. And initially, the senatorial families didn't think much of the equites. They figured they were kind of inferior because they weren't really patricians. But over time, the equites came to be a force to be reckoned with and a very prominent class by the time of the Principate of Augustus. So you really have three divisions. So a lot of the Civil War trouble that came up started off with the economic problem of three different groups of people who are all at odds with each other. And when the Gracchi brothers attempted to resolve the trouble very bluntly, they got a very blunt response, actually more like a sharp response from the aristocrats who managed to take them out when they caused rebellion. So you go from there into the various periods of disorder with Sulla Marius, with the first triumvirate. Quite a few other indications of trouble came up along the way. For instance, there was this figure Clodius, C-L-O-D-I-U-S, who ran for election as consul. He had an opponent, Milo. It was a very bloody election that led eventually to the murder of Clodius by Milo in 53 BC. And that was considered one of the bloodiest years in Roman history because there were, in fact, urban street thugs everywhere, essentially trying to enforce things with the election and basically beat up the enemy, as it turned out. So it was a very, very difficult time for everybody. Now, one other trend that should also be mentioned with regard to the first triumvirate, Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, that is in fact important for understanding what Augustus was aiming for, has to do with Pompey the Great himself. In 67 BC, there was in fact an attack made on the port of Ostia, which is at the mouth of the Tiber River, southwest of Rome. And the ships that were there were destroyed. So this was one occasion where Pompey the Great received dictatorial powers from the Senate in the form of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the SCU, to see to it that the Republic comes to no harm. And Pompey ended up carrying out a campaign against the pirates, which was relatively successful. So from there, you may remember that enemy Mithridates. Well, Mithridates, off in the Black Sea, was never really taken care of properly in the Sulla-Marius conflict. So Pompey in 66 BC received the generalship to go out and take on Mithridates. So he did so successfully and returned in what he thought would be triumph in 62 BC. But he didn't get the triumph. And it was because the Senate turned against Pompey, especially a prominent politician named Cato, C-A-T-O, who was responsible for that, that eventually drove Pompey back to Caesar and also to Crassus, and that was at the root of what led to the first triumvirate in 59 BC, where essentially Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus agreed themselves to come up with power in their own way and no longer to attempt to work with the Senate. Of course, that will change later again when Pompey ends up returning to the Senate against Caesar. So, as we've seen before, alliances have a tendency to change direction rather rapidly. In any event, a lot of these problems with the way that a rule changed hands or mutated in one direction or another lay at the heart of the way that Augustus saw that he needed to rule this new empire. The first thing is recognizing that Augustus actually was a blood relative of Julius Caesar anyway. He was actually Caesar's great nephew. But early on, Caesar adopted Augustus, then Octavian, as his adopted son. That turned out to be a very wise move on Caesar's part, because one of the points that in fact became a problem with Augustus himself was the difficulty of successorship. We actually historically have a very prominent example of that with Alexander the Great. He died out in the midst of his new empire, in the midst of this mess that was still Persia out there. And as a result, with there being no heir, there was a huge split in the Greek world with several different huge centers of power. And with there being no centrality and no real organization, there ended up an opening for the Romans to sweep in. And when the Romans had the motivation to do so with the alliance with Hannibal during the Second Punic War, the Romans came in and just grabbed everything and annexed it all into the then Roman Republic. So that difficulty existed. So Caesar at least had the forethought to get Octavian lined up to be that heir. But Caesar himself was not completely proficient in foreseeing what was coming, because he thought that once he had the perpetual dictator position, that he could pretty much do whatever he wanted, as long as he thought it was still serving the interest of Rome. So he may have intended to be beneficent to Rome, but the fact that he was in fact monarchical in a sense, and also was going to leave Rome essentially leaderless while he was away for this long stretch, those things together were seen as contrary to the interests of the Republic, and may have contributed to the decision by Brutus, Cassius, and other senators to team up on him on 44 BC on the Ides of March to take him down. So Augustus was a very sagacious student of history. He could see prior errors, and he did what he could to ensure that he would not repeat those errors. He also wanted to be sure that whatever he did with his power at least had the appearance of serving Rome, but would also, very importantly, ensure continuity, that there would not be another revolution, another toppling later because of further mistakes made. So, first of all, we should mention his name. Octavian was actually the original name of Octavius. He got the name Octavian when he was adopted into Caesar's family. That was the tradition. Augustus was the name that he received in triumph in 27 BC from the Senate. When the Senate conferred upon Augustus a triumph for everything that Augustus had achieved, especially over the last 4 years, as Augustus had gotten the Republic converted over into the Empire. They conferred upon him this name, revered. That is what Augustus means in English. In addition, they also gave him pater patriae, which was the word for father of one's countryland, in order to celebrate his success in saving the Roman state. So we received those titles, which effectively conferred upon him the real imperial position. However, the name that was given to that position was princeps, which is unlike the other Latin word imperator, which means commander of an army and also can mean emperor. Princeps means specifically first citizen. If you spell the first 6 letters of that, by the way, P-R-I-N-C-E, of course you have the word in English, prince. Now, the princeps, therefore, is the lead citizen of Rome. So he's not supposed to be some magnate up there telling everybody else what to do. Instead, the princeps is there to essentially ensure that the state is kept running correctly with the help of the Senate, at least in theory. So Augustus gets hold of that position. And then in order for Augustus to be able to range around the empire freely, he has to get over the thing that eventually got Caesar into trouble, which was the fact that when you're out in a province, you can have imperium while you're in the province, but you can't take that imperium home to Rome, and vice versa. So how do we get around that? Also, how do we get around other offices like censors and so on, lictors and such, all the lictors that go along with the various officers in order to indicate their position? How do we go along with all these various magistracies that all are used to power like this? So the way Augustus got around that was rather neat. He had the Senate declare his imperium to be this. And what better place to put this Latin word than directly under Jupiter's eagle? It's just perfect. Because this word, maius, in Latin means greater. So it's basically Augustus tells all the other magistrates at Rome, my command is greater than yours. And therefore, I can go wherever I want. And as a result, the Republican limitation of imperium here or imperium there is finally dissolved. And Augustus, with that problem resolved, is finally able to travel all around the empire as he needs to. And in fact, during his principate, he spent about 3/4 of his active time as emperor out in the provinces. He in fact had several years where he never did come home to Rome. Augustus accomplished many, many things in Rome itself as well as out in the provinces. Reorganizing the provinces to give them now finally a sense of peace and stability, that they would be able to run themselves as long as they continued to observe Roman rules properly and not try to rebel or do anything else that might disturb the order of things. The provinces were allowed to have their own civilizations pretty much undisturbed. Augustus also did a lot for Rome itself. He famously wrote in his Res Gestae, the description of his exploits, that he found the city made out of brick and converted it into one made out of marble. Probably a bit exaggerated, but he certainly did a lot to rebuild the parts of Rome that had been destroyed during the terrible century of the Civil War period, concluding the Republic. He also did a lot to ensure that security and fire safety were taken care of. He, in fact, is the instigator of the very first fire brigade in any city. The Romans had that. Plus, he also initiated a watch system that would essentially allow security to go on unencumbered, so that if there were any disturbances, the security would be there. The Latin term for that was vigilia, And it's the same word that we have in English, vigilant, meaning somebody who's awake and on the alert. So I'd like to conclude now with a bit of description of what it means for the Romans to pick up Greek mythology. Because you have, of course, Virgil's Aeneid, and you have Ovid's Metamorphoses that are obviously mythological. But what's really going on here with myth? Because the sense that we have from Greek myth is that the humans are supposed to understand their place in the order of things. They often do not actually understand exactly what the gods want. And it's not their place to try to find that out. If they try to do so, as we saw with Oedipus, they'll just be further destroyed. Basically, they have to simply submit and accept their role in place, worship the gods accordingly, pray to them for whatever they need, and they should do okay. But not to stretch too much, not to try to exceed or do anything else that might get the gods upset with them. The Romans have a very different purpose with mythology. Although they also have to be properly observant of the gods and not do anything out of step with what the gods want, from the Roman point of view, gods are meant to serve the Roman state. So you see how Aeneas is directed step after step after step through his journey by various deities and by fate to eventually arrive at Rome. So just even Juno herself, when she finally admits with Jupiter that it's really necessary to let this all happen, and Juno is finally assured that there will no longer be a Trojan name, even she finally gives in, despite the fact that giving in, of course, as she already knows, is going to condemn her favorite city of Carthage to destruction. So the gods are all there essentially to ensure that the Roman state will come to fruition as it needs to. So if the Roman Republic could be seen as kind of an experimental phase, like a lot of mistakes and errors and trying things out and not getting them right, kind of the way that you might say with Ovid's Metamorphoses, where all these mistakes that people make that get them turned into rocks and trees and flowers as punishment, it's kind of like weeding out all the errors so that we can get to the good stuff. If you think of that sifting approach, that's essentially what Roman mythology acts at. It's really an effort to establish the kind of behavior that the Roman state needs to have and the way that people need to contribute to the Roman state in collaboration with the gods, who are there to oversee everything but don't get directly involved in Roman affairs. In fact, it had frequently become a trope in both Greek and Roman thinking that the gods really just stay up there on Mount Olympus and they enjoy their ambrosia, nectar, or whatever, and they don't really get involved in human affairs that much. So effectively, any description we have of direct interaction between gods and mortals is seen by both Greeks and Romans as a thing of the long past. The Greeks and Romans are aware that gods and heroes and humans do not directly interact in the contemporary world. They don't expect that to happen. So instead, it's all about proper moral behavior. The Romans term that officium, O-F-F-I-C-I-U-M. It's the duty that one has toward the Roman state. And another concept that we have with Aeneas is pietas, P-I-E-T-A-S, which is similar to our word piety, but it doesn't mean just observing the worship of the gods, which is included. It's the sense of proper dutifulness, proper behavior, setting a model, setting standards for good behavior, and seeing to it that the Roman state is enhanced and improved by your contributions to it. So mythology, therefore, is much more practical, much more pragmatic for the Romans, even utilitarian. It essentially serves the purpose of showing everybody how the Roman state is supposed to run and the specific preordained way that the gods are meant to contribute to it. So although the Romans have their stories, the way that the Greeks tell all their various stories, those stories aren't just cute little tales told just for entertainment purposes. For the Romans, those tales are a description of the specific legacy that the Romans have picked up from their own past, for better or for worse. And the Romans can, from that past, can come to understand how the empire is now to operate from this time forward, how the gods will or will not be involved, and how every Roman citizen is expected to contribute to the continued prosperity of the Roman Empire to come. I here conclude, therefore, with a wish that everybody has enjoyed this course and benefited from it. We have one last thing to do tomorrow, which is to talk a little bit about the video that I'm going to have you watch on the side and give a short assignment of. I'm going to describe one video as an example, which is Black Orpheus, and then the video after that will be the review you need for your final exam. So thank you very much. I will see you back here tomorrow with the video description, and we'll start also reviewing for your final exam. See you tomorrow.